So I think that's everybody.
Good. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that introduction. That helps me. All right. Well, let me just start with prayer as we ask our Father to watch over our technology, which can go down so easily, and just thanking for what he's doing through all of our lives in the various parts of his world. Oh, Father, we do thank you that you are our God and our King and our all. You're everything to us, of course. And we just thank you, Father, that we can meet together and compare notes to what you're doing through each one of us in various parts of the world. And just thank you, Lord, to continue to pray your direction, your wisdom, your protection, your resources, all that we need, Lord, to do your work. Just pray that you'll give Jim peace through this time, and just let us hear from you, Father, as you lead us through your Spirit. Teach us what you want us to learn and to know, and just pray that we might do all things in a way that honor you. It's in your name, Jesus, we pray these things. Amen.
Amen.
Yeah, I didn't mention, Bill, my daughter actually is in Kyrgyzstan, so she's, I guess it's 10 p.m. there, isn't it, Rebecca?
Ah, okay.
So she teaches at the University of Central Asia.
Wow.
Teaches history.
Okay. Well, we'll try to keep you awake as much as possible. Well, let me just kind of go over the agenda for today. We really want the oral review time to be a celebration time. Hopefully a lot of the critical work has already been done through various ones of us by email and as we've looked at your project. And I don't like surprises at the oral review. I hope everything has been taken care of beforehand. It's a time that we can be sharing what Jim has done, and we can share with each other. It gives Jim an opportunity just to kind of summarize the work he's done for all of us, and then just to have a time to discuss and think about what the Lord's doing through this process. We'll then have a kind of a formal evaluation time with just three of us that are the voting members of this committee. That would be Steve and Grant and myself. We'll pull everybody else out of the session for about 10 minutes while we fill out an evaluation form. And then we'll bring everybody back in and celebrate with you for the results. All right. During the session, we will go ahead and have Jim give us a presentation to kind of just bring to memory the different pieces of this dissertation work. Then, like I said, we'll have some discussion time, and then we'll move into the evaluation. So, Jim, why don't you go ahead and share your screen?
Okay.
Lead us through your presentation.
Okay, I will do that. And I tested this out. I started my own little private Zoom and played with it to make sure it all worked.
Good.
So hopefully you all will see a title slide pop up on your screen.
Looking good.
All right, good. And I see 4 of you on my screen here, so if any of you fall asleep, I'll know what's happening. So the title of my dissertation is Here for a Purpose, and that becomes clear. That actually was a later addition as I did the research. That seemed like a fitting title. But mobilization among believers in diaspora communities of Metro Atlanta. As we were saying, the discussion leading into this, that it's no secret that migration is a thing, and it's just an increasing issue globally. And so it really caught my attention some years ago, actually as part of my BGU classes. I began to see this thing of migration where I understand it more and understand the missional implications. Just to do some framing of it, I know we all know this stuff, but let's see if I can get this thing to move. There we are. Just a couple statistics to throw out. As of 2017, the UN estimates 258 million people live outside of their countries of origin. That's a 50% increase since the year 2000. So an increasing move of people out of their countries of origin. And if you add those that are internally displaced, for example, someone moving from West China to East China, which could just as well be due to different countries, that number approaches 1 billion people. Several factors related to that we won't spend any time on, but just to mention things such as globalization, urbanization, overall economic lifting of the world has enabled people to travel more. That's been some of the factors. But the result of this, of course, is a large number of people who are living in communities outside of their countries of origin. And we, of course, refer to these as diaspora communities, especially in urban areas, but certainly not restricted to urban areas. And this is also around the world. One thing I don't need to tell this crew, but I often like to emphasize to people is we tend to think migration is a U.S. phenomenon because there's a little ethnocentrism, as Daryl would teach, but certainly diaspora is a global phenomenon. Now, getting a definition of diaspora is a little bit tricky because as one of the authors I read early on talked about diaspora as a slippery word. There's a lot of dynamism in the term itself, but a working definition I want to use just to kind of get us through this presentation is that a diaspora community would be a community of people living outside their or their ancestors' countries of origin, who still retain some sense of connection to and draw identity from the homeland and or communities within that shared origin. So basically, that's where a diaspora community would be distinguished from just an immigrant community. There's a lot of overlap, but the diaspora has that added layer of connectivity, of identity to it outside of just, I'm living outside of my country of origin. But it's a little bit deeper than that. A lot of discussion around the definition of diaspora. I get into that some in the dissertation. We can discuss that later if there's interest in that. It's a fascinating concept too, and even the history of that word's use is certainly a very interesting study. So this whole phenomenon of migration and diaspora caught the attention of social scientists some time ago, and more recently missiologists. Well, I think people have been talking about it before you began to see in the early 2000s kind of more organized discussions, focused discussions on the area of diaspora among missiologists. And then that really culminated in the 2010 Lausanne meeting in Cape Town, where this became a major topic of discussion. And basically asking the question, what is God up to? What is God up to? And looking at the phenomenon of diaspora from a theological standpoint, what does the Bible have to say about it? From a missiological standpoint, what does this have to do with God's mission, with what God's doing in the world and getting his word to the world? And then practically, how does this apply to mission practice? We see a growing interest in the topic in terms of publications, even degree programs focusing on diaspora, even books like Dr. Barola here is writing. However, one thing I've noticed as a practitioner in mission, as John Baxter, who's the head of Next Move, that's a organization that is a consortium of mission agencies looking at the theme of diaspora. And John often complains that there's a lot of talk about it, a lot of forums, a lot of writings, but not a lot has been worked on. What does this actually look like in terms of mission agency structure and mindsets? And so that's something that really had got my interest, is how does this actually translate into our practice of mission? So as I began studying diaspora, I became specifically interested in the possibilities of the diaspora population themselves, not just them as being recipients of ministry, but them as being the carriers of the word themselves. I want to say right away, I'm not the first person who has done that. Certainly there's other people and entire organizations that are formed around mobilizing and enabling diaspora individuals to be in mission. But it is an area that I really thought has a lot of potential that I wanted to understand better. So I wanted to focus on believers who are part of diaspora communities. What kind of ministries are they involved in? What motivates them? What sustains them? And then what implications do these findings have to do with the majority culture agencies and churches? I use the word majority culture. It's hard to find exact terms to use for a lot of this stuff that kind of collect all the right people and don't exclude the wrong people and all that stuff. But majority culture being basically agencies like ours or churches that would be probably predominantly white would be what we call majority culture groups here. But even those terms are not exactly precise. So I wanted to work with, to let my source of this be the diaspora people themselves. So I was very committed. This comes to some of my training in missiology. I want to start with the diaspora themselves and let them be my source in defining what's happening. I know there's a tendency of Western mission agencies to do a lot of planning and a lot of strategizing, then kind of lay that on top of the population we want to serve. So I wanted to say, no, let's do the other. Let's let their experience, let their understanding, their thoughts form any strategy, any practice we might develop. So I wanted to make sure any project I did really started with that. And to kind of narrow the scope down, I decided to focus on the metro Atlanta area. My premise is that that the findings will likely translate to other urban areas that would need to be tested. But by focusing on one area, I could keep the scope more limited with the hope that the findings would have relevance to other urban areas, certainly within the United States and Canada, and maybe even in other urban contexts around the world. So that kind of is the basis, the context of what motivated me and the mindset I came into it with. So I want to move now into some of the key literature that I use and the biblical underpinnings of the work I did. There has been an increasing number of books and publications written on this topic. I'm going to highlight just a couple that I drew heavily from. The first is the book written or edited, by Dr. Enoch Wan called Diaspora Missiology, Theory, Methodology, and Practice. It's come out in a second edition in 2014. I think the first edition was 2011. This book I found very soon in reading articles was often referenced, though I think it has become, and Dr. Ibarola could correct me on this, but I think it's become almost like a text in diaspora mission work. So a lot of references to this book. There's one framework that's used in talking about diaspora that I think was developed by the Lausanne Study Group and that Juan talks about in his book that kind of gives 4 categories of diaspora work. And like any categories, they're not exclusive. There's a lot of fuzziness, but I find that these do help me talk about diaspora and kind of what a focus is in ways that's accessible to people. And that is missions to the diaspora, which is often what people first think about with diaspora. You hear the phrase, "Oh, the world has moved to our backyard." That's the mindset. We as a church, we can minister to these immigrant communities, and that is certainly a valid thing. But as you can see, it's just one of 4 possibilities. The second possibility that one talks about is ministry missions through the diaspora, and that is connecting with diaspora believers as they reach out to other people within their diaspora group, other same culture diaspora groups, and even back to the home country. The third area, missions by and beyond the diaspora, which would be enabling and work with diaspora believers who are in mission and enabling them to work beyond their same culture group in diaspora, as well as even other countries. And then a fourth category that actually was added later. It wasn't in the first edition. It was added later based on feedback that Juan got. And that is missions with the diaspora, that be recognizing that the diaspora themselves have every ability to form mission entities, and that we would be partnering as in full partnership with them in God's mission, not necessarily just trying to help mobilize them, but recognize that. So those 4 areas I think can be helpful. I have seen in some forums of discussions where they're talked about so in rigid categories, and I think that's a U.S. tendency, which I will try not to get into. So there's several chapters of this book that are very helpful. The other book I drew heavily from is this one. This actually is where I met Steve Ibarola. We were at this conference together in Manila, the Philippines, in 2015. Again, part of the Lausanne process that was initiated with the Lausanne movement. Bringing together diaspora scholars and practitioners to do presentations with the idea they would be forming this compendium, which did come out a year after the conference. And this was a collection of writings by several scholars and practitioners, edited by 2 other names you see frequently in diaspora literature, Satiria Joytira and Tetsuno Yamamori. I'm sorry if I pronounced his name incorrectly, but this was a very helpful compendium of a lot of case studies, a little more practical, maybe less on just the strictly academic side. And I drew very heavily from this, several helpful articles. One thing they said from the stage I remember distinctly in Manila was the diaspora missiology is a majority world story. And just remembering that and maintaining the appropriate posture as a Western person who's lived outside of my missionary service, has lived in one place. And I think we really see that in the diaspora literature, that so much of the literature coming out, even a lot of the chapters in these books, are written by majority world scholars and practitioners, many of whom themselves are part of diaspora communities. So that's been an important thing to keep in mind whenever we're looking at diaspora mission. Now, one of the things I noticed in these books, as well as the several other books I referenced in this dissertation, is that almost every book will begin with a kind of a scriptural basis of diaspora. So I was really pleased when I looked at the Backy layout for the dissertation, that a theological underpinning was an entire chapter, because that has very much been the practice I've seen in the diaspora missiology. And of course, if you go to the Bible, it's not hard to find diaspora and immigration. In fact, as I often share in churches, sometime take your Bible and read it through the lens of migration. You'll be rather astonished at what you find. It's just throughout the Bible. So you can write several books just on that topic. I want to highlight the key themes that I found very relevant in the biblical work I did to my research questions. The first of those themes is that God frequently uses people on the move, both as recipients as instruments of his revelation. The classic example of this is the person of Abraham himself, who his move into a new place, his move into to migration is where God began to reveal and create a whole new people. But they were first displaced from their place of origin. So that whole idea that people on the move are recipients and instruments of God's revelation. The theology of this that really, to me, it confirmed the decision I had to focus on the believers in the diaspora, was an observation that often in the biblical record, the word of God travels with the people on the move. So we think of ministry to the diaspora, like I said, it's a valid thing, but the biblical example usually is the people who are in diaspora or are in process of that are the ones who are carriers of the word. So that's why I was pleased to kind of be taking that tact on my research. The second major area is that diaspora experiences are understood theologically. This ties into the whole definition of the word diaspora itself, of being richer than simply living outside of one's country of origin. Certainly in the Bible, we see that with the Exodus. There's no question the Exodus was understood theologically and became a pivotal event in the identity of the Jewish people. And then the exile as well, another major diaspora event that was very significant in the experience of the Jewish people and formative and fully understood. The prophets, a lot of the time of the prophets is spent giving a theological understanding of what was soon to be the experience, or was the current experience, of the Jews in diaspora. Moving into the New Testament, we see the scattered Jewish community in the Roman Empire became the nodes for early church development. The story of the early church is a diaspora story. As the church spread, it spread along the routes of the Jewish diaspora, and then through persecution, what became even the Christian diaspora throughout the Roman Empire. So that I think is a very, very significant observation. And then finally, which really is directly related to my research, is that as a diaspora Jew, the Apostle Paul is well suited to be the bridge person from Jewish to Gentile understandings of the gospel. So Paul himself, growing up in Tarsus as a diaspora Jew, well trained in the Hebrew culture, the Pharisaic theology, but also obviously well versed in Greek and in the Greek rhetoric, which we can see from his letters, that Paul in himself as a diaspora person was uniquely suited to be one who would carry the mission of God. So those are four major things that I kind of brought out from the scripture studies, although there's a ton more we could get into. But I want to move next, before I get too long on these other things that are great, hugely interesting, but move into my actual research and the design of the research and then the findings themselves. So I did choose to go with the qualitative design for the research. The qualitative design enabled me to have the flexibility I felt like I needed. I really wanted to hear from the people, hear their stories, and be as little prescription as possible of what I expected to find, or even how things where the research would lead me. And so the qualitative research method was a good fit for that. I wanted to hear the people's stories themselves. I also wanted to experiment with a design, which I would call a relational approach. This kind of came out of, some of it's my personality, I'll have to be honest, but some of it came out of one of the chapters in Juan's book, where he did a rather scathing critique of what he would call the managerial mission strategy, which he would say typifies much of Western missiology. And I would say the critique may be a little bit harsh, but it was important to read it. And a lot of what he actually was echoing was some critique that Samuel Escobar, and I went back to that original source document that Samuel Escobar wrote in the late 90s, with the same critique, really raising some questions about some of the assumptions that were behind a lot of the managerial methodology that pretty well dominated Western missions. So I wanted to take an experiment with that and even build a relational approach into my methodology. So what would it look like if I'm going to study diaspora in one and others claim that a relational approach is the right approach with diaspora in mission? What would happen if I took that approach even in my methodology? So for example, all the people that I interviewed, I connect with them through relational networks. I didn't do like a blast email or put up a notice down in Clarkson saying, do you want to talk to me? I'm interested to do this research, but I did it through people I knew that were practitioners or were connected in different diaspora communities. And it was really neat that through those relationships, I got a diversity of people, different ages, genders, cultural backgrounds, lengths of time here, reasons for having come to the United States. The other thing is I had nobody refuse. When I invited them to the discussion, told them what it was about, nobody said no. I only had two people that after a back and forth, they didn't respond, which could have been a no. I decided not to push it because I really wanted to make sure I only had people participating who were really eager to be a part of this. So it was interesting. So that was kind of the relational approach. And of course, with taking a relational approach, that's where Steve really suggested I dig a little bit into ethnographic methods. And so I did that and found it was perfectly, the methodology of ethnography was well suited for the kind of research I wanted to do. I drew heavily from Wolcott's book, Ethnography, A Way of Seeing. And his idea of semi-structured interviews was the method I used for interviews, where I had a set of questions I used, but I didn't like read from a list of questions. It was much more of a conversation. And there's a willingness to let the interview itself go, let the interviewee determine some of the direction of the interview as part of the interviews. And so that was a helpful way of looking at it. And I want to mention that the questions I had on the interviews themselves were actually vetted through several connections I had through my Next Move group of people, some of whom were majority world members of diaspora communities themselves, that helped me with my questions. So they'd be questions that people could relate to and would not be questions that would just kind of put them off. So it was a very relational approach. The other thing I like about the ethnographic approach is it recognizes that the researcher, him or herself, is part of the data. That you're not an objective outsider that doesn't influence the interview or influence the finding itself, but you actually recognize that you're part of the finding. I think that was an important insight. It took some of the pressure off. It also enabled me to really try to connect with people relationally. And I would say that the data I got from that result was actually more accurate than if I pretended that I somehow myself wasn't engaging or connecting with the conversation. So that was the design. What was interesting as I did the process is I became just observing that the method itself was transforming and empowering. So the very process of sitting down with people and asking questions about them and asking about the ministry and asking their ideas itself, I was seeing how it was affirming for them, empowering for them, and even transformative. So it's almost like the method itself became part of the findings of the research. So finally, I want to move into some of the findings themselves. So I did 15 interviews conducted between November 1st and December 20th of 2018. There's a typo. 2018, I am not that prophetic. The participants, as I mentioned, all the participants agreed. I met with them. It was really their choice. I would suggest a coffee shop or a neutral place to meet. Most of the interviews I did were in coffee shops or cafes. One person insisted I meet in his home, and I had a wonderful dish of North Indian food as we talked about ministry and diaspora. A couple of people wanted to meet in churches where they attended, and then one person actually was out of the country, and we met on Skype. I didn't constrain the interviews with time limits. I told people that an hour and a half should be sufficient, but I made sure I had blocked out 3 or 4 hours of time to make sure I was not ever trying to move things along too quickly, but let them set the pace of the interview. Most of the interviews lasted about an hour and a half. The shortest one was an hour because the person had to leave. The longest one lasted well over 3 hours. And it was great fun. Very conversational, but clearly an interview. I wanted for ethics and also for appropriateness, make it clear this is an interview. I'm doing research. Of course, doing a consent form with each of them helped make it very clear this is research. Most of them I recorded with permission. I recorded their interviews so I could come back to them as I was writing up my findings. What was interesting, one of the major findings is that people want to tell their stories. my research was more about ministry and what motivates your ministry. So my questions in the interview around story was more just to identify how long they'd been here, where they came from, just a little bit about their experience, but I didn't intend that to be a large part of our discussion because it wasn't directly related, or so I thought going into this, to what would be my actual research. What I found was that people wanted to sit here for a while, and that often the story portion of how they got here and what they were experiencing before they left their country of origin often took up 30 minutes or longer. One gentleman even came with an entire folder full of documents and pictures and things from his life before he had come to the United States. And I found that across the board, regardless of why they came or when they came, how long they'd been here, this was the experience. The only exception was that the two people I interviewed who came as children, what we call 1.5 generation immigrants, did not spend as much time on that. They still did spend some time on their story, but there didn't seem to be as much eagerness to stay there as with the other people. Related to that, I did some distinguishing between the why people came into two major or general categories, looking at push and pull. Push factors being factors in the country of origin that kind of made someone decide they wanted to leave the country, as well as pull factors being factors in the destination country that drew people into it. Immigration is much more complicated than simply having two categories. That's very clear. But again, like with the other categories, I find it's helpful to kind of see these as two general. One tends to be a little more weighted than the other in most cases in the experience I had with these 15 people. 6 of the people I talked to were definitely more left their country, not out of a decision, I want to go somewhere else, but out of necessity, came as refugees, asylum. One case was health of children, that the daughter needed life-saving treatment that was only accessible if he left his home country with his family. And then pull factors were either family was already in this country, they came here to be with family. Some actually came ministry, they felt called to come to the United States for ministry purposes. And some came for economics, for job and opportunities. So, and I say that because there were some distinctions in the story. The people who came with push factors tended to want to spend more time and were more emphatic about their story and expressing their story than those who came on pull factors, although everybody did want to spend time with their story. The other thing that was another observation of the story is the complexity of the immigration system. That wasn't necessarily part of my research, but it was part of my findings. Is the immigration system, at least in the United States, is extremely complex. And regardless of which side of that push or pull and what their motivation was, where they came from, almost to the person, there were stories of real challenges and uncertainty and unpredictability in navigating the system. One interesting stat I mentioned in the dissertation, a Cato Institute blog noted that a certain type of employment visa for Indians has an official wait time of 150 years to qualify for residency. So if you plan to retire at 140, you're out of luck. The other finding, which I think is probably the thing that struck me probably the hardest of all this, was the here for a purpose, and that's what found its way into my title. This showed up in every interview, and I was very careful, to the best of my ability, not to seed the interview with that or to fish for that. But it just came out very clearly, a deep sense of God's purpose. Sometimes as a direct cause, people actually saying words like, well, God moved us here, God brought us here. Sometimes more as a sense that this is how God's going to use us. Okay, we came here, maybe it was a horrible situation that got us here, but we believe God had us here for a purpose. Sometimes they even gave miraculous experiences of how God got them here or how God kept them here. Again, as you look at the visa system, sometimes getting a visa itself is rather miraculous. And this was really a confirmation of the theological richness of the whole idea of diaspora. It was a confirmation of that they would see real meaning in their being in diaspora, but not just theological meaning, also missiological meaning. And the quote I have here is one of the pastors expressed it. He actually pastors a church, and he sees his whole church as being here for missional purposes. And he said, we feel God brought us here to do something in this country also. We did not just come here by chance, but by the plan of God. So we have a big responsibility to this country, and we believe God is going to use this church to contribute something to the country. So the sense of purpose. And finally, the idea of identity and connections. And this was certainly, I expected this because the literature had talked about this a lot, that diaspora tend to have a real connectivity across other diaspora communities of the same culture, as well as back to the home country. And certainly I saw this exemplified by the people I interviewed. Now, there was different degrees of how that was expressed, what it looked like, but all of them had that. The other consistency thing in terms of identity was the ambiguity of identity. It was expressed differently by different people, but I often would hear these expressions of kind of an in-between feeling, especially the longer-term people have that ambiguity, and even the children of diaspora. One of the young people I talked to was Sudanese, but came when he was a little boy and had spent his early years in a refugee situation. And he said when he went to Sudan for the first time as a young man to visit family, he said, in Sudan, I was American. When I'm in America, I'm Sudanese. A Bangladeshi family who came here and actually very intensely planned to assimilate as much as possible and not kind of enclave with other Bangladeshis. But he said, we have an identity crisis. We are not Americans, but we're not Bangladeshis. So this ambiguity of identity is a common trait that I found. And then finally, a limited connection to other diasporas and majority culture churches. This one kind of surprised me. I thought there might be more of a sense of commonality between diaspora groups, and found that, at least in my interviews here, rather absent, that most of them kept to themselves within their diaspora communities and didn't necessarily connect with other communities. Maybe there's more of that in your culture, and I think Grant's dissertation may be able to speak to this more than I got into, and I didn't have a large enough sample size to really test this culture by culture. But that did surprise me, and a lack of connection for those who are part of diaspora churches, a lack of connection to the majority culture church. Unless they actually are attending a majority culture church, there was a limited connection. That was an important finding. So what did I learn, and how do we apply this? I'm going to wrap it up with this, and we'll have some great discussion. Well, the first thing I feel like I learned is the relational strategy I think is valid. I think is well suited for diaspora engagement. Exactly what that means, what that looks like, I am going to be on a journey myself to dig into that. But I really believe that some of the Juan's critiques and some of the ways that we go at diaspora is a lot of trying to set aside agendas and 5-year plans in some cases, certainly have a great deal of intentionality, but kind of creating the space, having the conversations to let things develop, let God work, which means maintaining a listening and learning posture. And then I do believe the tools of ethnography, we don't have to use the big words to scare people away, but I think we need to help people understand the basic tools and mindsets of ethnography in our churches and our agencies that will help enhance a relational approach to developing ministry strategies. And this is something I took away personally as well, is my own leadership style. How do I dig into that in a very intentional way? The other area I think has got real potential for fruit in mobilization among diaspora, and that is this whole idea of purpose. How can we as outsiders, I'm speaking of myself here and the majority of people in agencies and churches, how do we help connect people to the purpose? Obviously, it's not my place to say you have a purpose in being here, but what are the ways I could do that? Well, I think one, as I mentioned, just by listening to people's stories seemed to affirm in them. I almost saw this sense of purpose swell up in them even as they shared their stories. So being willing to listen in the context of relationships to the stories of diaspora. I'm exploring diaspora examples in the scriptures. They're so clear in the scriptures how God used diaspora, just giving people the opportunity to see that connection of how this is the way God has worked throughout his interaction with humanity. And asking good questions that enable healing, affirmation, and opportunity for people to connect to purpose. Sort of a Barnabas role. I love that in Acts chapter 8, where you have the Antioch church meeting. Barnabas comes up to check on it. And one of the first things Barnabas does when he sees there, he goes and gets Paul, because he knows Paul has that diaspora experience. He knows Paul can be the bridge that the Antioch church needs to be able to move into its full identity as a church of Christ. So I love that. I think we can have that Barnabas role of introducing people and connecting people to purpose. Another very practical area is just being a resource. I think there could be a great asset if some churches already do like ESL, that's a practical need, but even having some understanding of the immigration rules here, the legal needs, education needs, all the needs that surround living as a migrant. I'm guessing that most churches, And I'll confess, even most agencies don't really know the complexity. And so can we dig into that and be a resource to help people who are here in diaspora and partner with them? And then finally, connecting to diaspora churches. I really think there's great possibilities there. My research didn't go into actually testing that, but I think that connecting with diaspora churches, exploring possibilities of partnership, how that connects back to the homeland, as well as how can we enable and facilitate and be partners in ministry locally with diaspora church, I think has great possibilities. On the personal note, what is this doing for me as a mission leader? What do I plan to do with this research? One thing I've appreciated about BACI is they're very clear that if we don't use it, it doesn't count. They don't use those words, I don't think, Bill, but they really want it to be a practical degree, not just simply a research degree. And so I wanted to give some thought as to how has this changed me? How will this affect my own role and my own leadership? One is through the Next Move Forum, which is actually what developed this research, came very much out of questions we were asking at Next Move. So I have the possibility, I am one of the coaches in Next Move, I have the possibility of influencing mission agency policies and structures and mindsets through this research, through the forum, and plan to do that. In fact, I'm offering to do an actual forum at the Next Move meeting to discuss the findings of this dissertation. I'm working with my own staff, the TMS Global staff, in developing diaspora components into our church mobilization curriculum. We do a lot of mobilization of churches. I think we need to do a lot more work in helping churches understand and engage with diaspora communities, especially not just seeing them as recipients of our benevolence, which is kind of the automatic default setting because it keeps the power dynamics where they were. But how do we actually connect to them as partners in a mutual learning relationship for the kingdom? I think helping train our churches in doing that is an area I can work in. I want to continue to learn from diaspora believers. I want to expand the network and know more people locally and globally that are part of these communities that can continue to help me see my blind spots and help us develop in this area. I really want to make sure that there's a lot of voices from the diaspora in these discussions. And then connect with local diaspora churches around the themes of mobilization and partnership. So asking, how can we serve you to the different churches? I was driving the other day, drove by a Vietnamese church I hadn't noticed before. And so I've written on my list of things just to stop there and just learn who they are and say, are there ways we can serve you as fellow members of the community here. I want to share one final story that I thought was just an amazing picture that God gave me, even though I wasn't looking for it. As I was having my interview with one of my folks here, he's a Nepalese Bhutanese pastor. In just our small talk, he mentioned the place he had lived as a refugee for a while in North India and actually had started a Bible school up there. And it's the same city that our agency was going to be doing some training in 2 months. So I mentioned that to him. I said, is there any way that could be of help to you? He said, well, let me check. And so I put him in touch with our director of mobilization, international mobilization. And the end result was that 3 church planters from Bhutan came to our training in North India and were encouraged by it and were able to network with other church planters in the region, all because of a discussion that happened over coffee in Atlanta, Georgia. To me, that's just a picture of the power of diaspora and the power of a relational approach that kind of goes in, creates a space, has the conversations, and sees what God will do. And that's my final conclusion. I need to drink more coffee. Robbie David, one of my good friends and mentors, said to me one time we were on a trip having coffee with some mission leaders in Singapore. He says, sometimes you just need to get in the room with the right people, drink coffee, and see what the Holy Spirit will do. I thought that was a beautiful picture of what a relational strategy looks like. Fortunately, I do like coffee and plan to drink a lot of it. And that ends my presentation.
All right. Thank you, Jim. Go ahead and stop sharing on yours, then we can be able to see everybody's faces a little better. There we go. All right. Well, let's take a little time. Those of you that have worked with Jim very closely on this project, I really appreciate you kind of taking the lead on some of the questions because you're going to know the project best. I'll interject issues as I see fit. So let's kind of open the discussion with some thoughts, topics, things you'd like to discuss, things you'd like to dig into a little further. So the microphone is open.
Do you want the learning committee to go last?
No, everybody is we're on an equal ground here. So yeah, go ahead, anybody can talk.
Okay.
Well, let me just say that one of the things that interested me about the topic, Jim talked about these kind of four categories that diaspora missiology has developed: missions to the diaspora, missions through the diaspora, missions beyond the diaspora, and missions with the diaspora. And I think the last category is the one that's got really sort of the least amount of attention in many ways. And so I think that that's a real contribution that Jim's dissertation makes, is it's this idea of, well, how do we really work with, and to work with the diaspora is actually the category that developed last.
Mm-hmm.
The diaspora missiologists who were working on these kinds of things. But I think it's a very important one. And so I was really excited when I found that that was what Jim wanted to focus on, because I think that it's not only really practical, but it's also it also fills sort of a gap in some ways in the diaspora missiology literature, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think one of the things that influenced me was one of the articles, and I don't have Darrell Whiteman's recall on who wrote what, but in looking at the Apostle Paul, that really struck me is these people have their own experience uniquely gifts them with some things that a lot of us had to go through a lot of training for, and still it may not be as natural to us as others. So yeah, I would agree. And just the determination, we're so good at making other people ends to, or means to our ends, and really trying to resist that default setting that I feel like we can fall into so easily unintentionally.
Jim, I want to say some comments about the overall dissertation, and I have some questions for you. I really like the way the dissertation was integrated so well, from beginning to end. It didn't have you did have separate chapters, but you kept connecting chapters with each other, and I thought it was a well integrated dissertation. You also write very well. It was, the editor and me found about 3 typos.
Well, the technical editor bled pretty heavily on it, but they warned me that would happen, so I wasn't too taken aback when I got the technical edit back and every page was covered with red. But anyhow,
I really appreciated your understanding and use of ethnography. You really you understood it at a deep level. You used it extremely well, and I like the concept of ethnography as a way of seeing, which is both very incarnational and very missiological.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a natural way to gather information. And of course, anthropologists do ethnography more than quantitative surveys. And
right.
Yesterday, I spoke in our Sunday school class called "All Things Considered in Light of the Gospel," and my topic was more Jesus, less religion. And I referred to a survey done by the Barna Institute, whether Christians are perceived to be more Pharisaical or more Christ-like, and comments were about the survey. Well, is this really accurate? Well, an anthropological ethnographic study would probably have revealed different things. So I really like the way that you went about that. Now, I've got a question. When does a refugee become a part of diaspora?
Yeah, I never thought of that question in particular. Refugees, the way I've seen it, I'm not a specialist on refugees. So one thing I do like to remind, especially North Americans right now, because refugees are a thing, is that refugees are a very small part of diaspora. They're an important part, a significant part, and have their own unique set of circumstances, but they are not the majority of people that are on the move. I would think I probably would need to talk to other people to see who have worked more with refugees. My feeling is the way the diaspora is defined to me is that they still have the identity. There still is a connectivity to their home country. They're still connected to the culture. They'd be diaspora even in that refugee camp. Mm-hmm. But they're stuck in Jordan, even though it's not a permanent location. They're still diaspora. They're not in a permanently settled location. But I would still expect that a lot of the diaspora attributes would be there.
Okay.
The main distinction I've seen with refugees is that they're in relief mode, where ministry to refugees often has to be more in relief mode rather than more development mode. That's one of the main differences in how you approach.
And that would be my follow-up question. How would ministry with refugees and migrants be different than that with diaspora?
That's been my observation. I did not, no one I interviewed was still part of a refugee population per se. Now, what I hear is more anecdotally from people, especially people who are in Jordan, is that there's some amazing things happening in refugee camps, that believers who are part of refugee communities are just doing ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what one of the people said is they said, I was doing ministry back in Bhutan. I'm doing ministry here. That doesn't, I just changed location. I'm still going to do ministry.
I saw that.
And I've heard that in South Sudan or Uganda as well. The South Sudanese who are already believers are already forming churches and doing ministry.
Mm-hmm.
So I think some of that happens. And again, that's where I think if we go in as outsiders, say, I need to minister to these poor refugees, and we miss that, we missed a huge opportunity. If we go in first, say, what is God doing here? And see the South Sudanese who's building a church, then say, how do we connect to that? Rather than how do we start a church or a Bible study, whatever.
That's a very different mindset, and it's an important one. Were any of your participant interviews done in Clarkston?
One of them actually took place in Clarkston. We actually met at the coffee shop, the Refugee Coffee in Clarkston.
Only one of your 15 people was from Clarkston?
Yeah.
Okay.
And he did come as a refugee. There was two people that came actually as refugees in my interviews. Yeah.
Okay, I'll have some questions later, but that's enough for now.
Sure, thanks. And I want to give Steve credit on the ethnography. I want to give Steve credit on that, because actually we were standing in Manila. I remember Steve, and Steve was, we're talking about the presentations. He said, what I wish they do is have more ethnography talked about here. And I was kind of like agreeing with him, really not knowing what he was talking about. And then I had to come back and read some books. So I became convinced he was right. So that's why I took that approach. But I remember you saying that in Manila, that observation.
For me, that was the disappointment of the conference in Manila, was the way they kind of had it set up. You had these plenary sessions where there would be a speaker for the entire group, and then they would have these breakout sessions. Now, in some of the breakout sessions, you would have people who, like Stanley John and others that had done ethnographic research for their particular projects. So it came out some in those breakout groups, but there was really nobody who stood up front at the plenary sessions, and really there was hardly any social scientific information presented at all. I think they had two demographers who basically were just talking about the demographics of migration, and that I actually got called by one of the organizers, like 2 weeks or so before the conference was going to start, and they said, do you want to give a presentation on? And I said, look, I've written stuff on this and I could give a presentation on that, but I said, this is way too short a period of time to say, put together a plenary presentation for these meetings. So it was sort of like an afterthought really for them. And then since I couldn't do that, then they ended up not really having anybody in the plenary meeting that presented a social. And that's actually one of the reasons why I decided to try to do this book, was I felt like we really needed to have more of a social scientific approach so I'll have a chapter in the book that deals with using ethnography for understanding these diaspora communities and that kind of thing. But I think it's been a weakness of the Luzon movement, diaspora missiology.
Well,
movement.
Absolutely. It's a weakness of almost all mission organizations.
Yeah. And let me address the issue of refugees and diaspora. I think Jim's right. I think in some ways, since a diaspora is really people who come from a common place of origin, and so they share to some degree certain elements of culture, and they still have a sense of identity related to their countries of origin. I think refugees fit into that as well as any other group as far as diasporas are concerned. In fact, if you think about the Laotians, this is an interesting group, right? Most Laotians came over as refugees after the fall of or the end of the Vietnam War. And our policy in the United States, at least then, was to disperse these people, right? We didn't, in some ways, we didn't want them to form diasporas, right? So they dispersed them around the United States. But what happens is eventually you get these centers, right, where the migrants themselves or the refugees start migrating to. So Minneapolis was one of those big centers for Laotians. And I worked with an organization in California that was called Lao Family Community. And we worked with not just Laotians, but it was founded by Hmong. It was founded by Hmong. And so I think that that's a really good example of how people come as refugees, but then they still seek out people that are like themselves, right? Those communities that where they can speak their language, where they can have their food, where they can, share so many things that they just don't share with the broader society.
And certainly one of the findings I think I mentioned in the dissertation I did in the presentation is what technology has done is just poured gas on that connectivity. Some Uzbek friends Rebecca has from school that have become friends of ours. Just the way they're connected to Uzbeks across the country is just uncanny. They all know about each other. And to the person, even the people who were specifically trying to assimilate, they knew the diaspora organization, that there was an entity formed that was actually doing this. And most of them do. There will be a Bengali Association of Atlanta or a Bhutan Association of Atlanta. They're organized. And man, do they communicate. They use WhatsApp and Skype like no one's business.
Even when I did my dissertation research in 89 and 90 among internal migrants in Spain. So these are people from other parts of Spain that migrated to the Basque Country to work in the industries. And once they started doing that, coming from these different parts of Spain, they started developing their own social clubs. So in the town that I was doing my research, there was one called Casa de Extremadura, right? Well, this was a social club that was founded by people that had migrated from the area of Extremadura in Spain to the Basque Country. And it was the same thing. It was where they could gather. It's where they could come together and sort of continue to experience and fellowship with people that, again, were more like them than the broader Basque community that they had moved into.
Helpful.
Okay, well, I have a question. Well, first, thanks, Jim. I have a question, but first I just want to say that I just really appreciate the fact that someone who's in leadership at a large mission organization took the time to step back and really ask the question, what has God up to first? And as a result, I think you did just really crucial and timely research, asked really good research questions, and your methodology, using the ethnographic methods, was clearly empowering, like you said. And you also clearly started with them and listened very well. As a result, I think you got some, really good data that's current and original data on a very important topic. So we were able to hear, again, the voices of people on the move who are carriers of God's word, like you said, and that's just really important. So I guess my question is just, you clearly showed the kind of the benefits of this relational strategy. In just talking to the 15 people you did, you saw the benefits and the opportunities that come from this kind of this relational strategy and kind of in engaging with diaspora. So I guess in someone who's in leadership, do you see people might agree to it, theologically, philosophically, but do you see in talking to churches or other mission organizations, are there any kind of logistical challenges or restraints? Can you see as you share this and kind of the benefits and opportunities that you have seen as you share this with churches and mission organizations? Can you foresee any challenges or things that might make it difficult?
That's a good question. The challenges I see is the lack of precision. I think some organizations are more bent toward that, but wanting the 5-year plan and the outcomes and the goals. And if I do this, if I do A, I will get B. And not be able to give that level of precision, I think will be a challenge in some agencies. It'll be interesting as I start doing some coaching of agencies to see what I encounter as I do that. I may be thrilled, I may be disillusioned, I don't know. And so I think that's be one challenge. The other is just, I think there is such a dominant mindset in so many churches. I know Catherine could certainly speak to this. They've encountered this. there's such a mindset in how things work that people are not even seeing the power dynamics that is the default setting, because that's just how things have always been. And so helping move people out of that mindset, I think, will be a challenge. I think it needs to be done gently. I think if it's done with arrogance and forcefulness and steering, I don't think it will get us anywhere. But I think it has to be done, that people begin to have a different shift of what ministry looks like, because ministry is so much been conceptualized by those of us who are blessed, using the terms, helping those who are not blessed. It's that dynamic is what ministry and mission looks like in most of our conceptualizations. So trying to shift that I think, will be a big challenge. So that's my quick answer, but that's kind of an unknown for me, to be honest.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Yeah, thank you. Good.
Yeah, I think you're gonna, you will get pushback probably from people who still have the dominant kind of managerial mindset when it comes to missions. Let's develop a plan. Let's set up a strategy. Let's put a date on it. All diasporas reached by 2020, or something like that. And that's kind of our reflexive mode.
I think I drink 10 cups of coffee by the end of April.
Yeah.
Not sure if that'll fly or not. No, those are good questions. And what metrics look like? Oh, go ahead, Catherine. I really want to hear from you on this.
Yeah, some of my questions are definitely related to that ministry definition. But first of all, I appreciate this, being able to be a part of this, because this really is a celebration, and we've all been a part of this journey for a long time. And as I was reading through the dissertation, it was a bit surreal, like this, it's here. And I just want to celebrate that with you, and thank you for being able to be a part of this. It's been really great. My question was about ministry definition. How did you, and maybe you didn't explicitly, but how do you define ministry in this, in your research, and how do you think that the people you interviewed define ministry? And then I have a couple of follow-up questions that are related to that.
That's a good question. I guess in most cases, I expect I have a broader view of ministry than most people I interviewed would have. So it was fortunate. I think it'd be a harder situation if it was the other way around. Where most of them would have defined ministry as something specifically either evangelistic in nature or discipleship in nature, not always church connected, but often church connected ministry. I would certainly have a broader definition of doing something to assist others as a result of one's faith. I think there needs to be a faith component in it. So I'd probably have a broader definition, but certainly all the people I interviewed would have had a more specific thing of, I'm doing Bible studies, I'm reaching people, I'm trying to do mission back in my home country. They would probably have a narrower definition of ministry.
Yeah, and that was part of my follow-up. Do you think that, I noticed that some people said, well, I need to, my spouse needs a full-time job so I can do ministry, or there was definitely this sort of secular sacred divide of what is considered ministry. And yet diaspora tend to have incredible entrepreneurial skills. How do you think they would respond to a more vocationally driven definition of ministry that could be more expansive than just, say, evangelism or discipleship, something that's more along the lines what you're talking about? Did you sense that would be received or not as a viable definition?
I think it'd be received. I think it'd be received over time, and by different people. It depends on their background. The one person that you referred to is Indian, and Indians tend to have very, very secular sacred divide. Now, it was interesting when I had a diaspora meeting within TMS, I asked him and his wife to both be there. And that was one of the very reasons I did that. I wanted to at least show in my own mindset that her working at Quest Diagnostic as a biochemist is extremely missional. Well, it was fantastic. She sits in this room and talks about all the people in her lab. There's like 10 different countries represented in her biochemistry lab. And she's able to talk to them about spiritual matters. So I think we have to, again, I think it has to be gentle, but kind of asking good questions and affirming when we do see it, like in this guy's wife's case, really affirming it and and making it clear that we ascribe just as much value to what she's doing as the biochemist who's earning the bread, as he's doing as the missionary, where he does have the flexibility to go to Sri Lanka, go to India and do things. So it's a significant thing he's doing. But I agree, trying to fuzz those lines. And I think that's important in the outsiders. That's a good point to have my sniffer on for, is if we go in with our secular sacred divide in the diaspora communities, we actually can disempower in some cases. Now, one of the people I didn't actually interview, but someone I met later, it was really cool because he is a very successful business person from Bangladesh who sees that as God's enabling him to be engaged in ministry, both at the workplace as well as outside of the workplace. So I have seen examples of diaspora people who do have that understanding. But that's a really good point and something to be aware of.
I'd like to follow up on Catherine's excellent questions. As I was reading through the interviews, I thought, man, these people see ministry primarily in terms of evangelism and church planting.
No question.
Yet almost all of them come from a situation of real need for social justice. And I was wondering, are they aware of this? Do they see that following Jesus relates to that? Or is it just more of the same, evangelism and church planting?
That's a good question. I don't think I could answer it. I think that, and it'd be the same response to Catherine's question. I think most of them come from backgrounds where that has been what they have learned, for better or worse. And so it would be a process of helping connect them to that. What does that look like? That's a really good question. I would say, I'm just trying to go over my head the people I interviewed. And I would say probably most of them would not have had that understanding. Maybe one or two that would have. But most of them
probably haven't seen it modeled themselves, right?
Exactly. So I think it's going to probably be a matter of asking good questions and then really affirming it when we see it.
Yeah.
Looking up those things when we see it. Yeah.
So this is seems to me to be another important part of what it means to work with the diasporas, right? Because it's not just that we're learning from them. I mean, we are, and I think that ethnographic approach and relational approach is really important. But it also means that we're working together. Mm-hmm. And so these issues that they may not have been exposed to in their home countries, even though as Daryl was talking about, they come from contexts where issues of social justice would have been probably very important. But we can spiritualize all of that, and then so as we work together, then one of the things that they might be able to learn from us is taking social issues of social justice and those kinds of things seriously as well, and seeing that as part of the gospel, not just something on the periphery, but really integrated in with the gospel,
And I think that's a role that we can play as churches, as agencies, is through the networks we make, we can create spaces for those discussions to happen. I think a space like Catherine and John have down at Center for, where we invite people in and then talk about these things in a multicultural setting. And so people begin to hear from other people. And so I think those are the kind of things that almost have to be discovered. We could have to do a lecture, give somebody a book, but I think there's a lot of discovery that has to happen.
Yeah.
In that.
We had a student give a presentation at our PhD seminar one morning. He was from the Philippines, and of course, issues of social justice in the Philippines they've skyrocketed,
especially now. Yeah.
And so, but he's given this presentation, and he's talking about how the churches are all behind the president and how they love his law and order kind of approach, and on and on and on. And when he finished, I asked the question. I said, so. I tried to ask it gently, and I said, a lot of times when you have leaders who start talking about law and order and, these kinds of things, I said, oftentimes what goes along with that is then abuse and issues of, social justice and the things that are going on in the Philippines, right?
Yeah.
And his response to me was like, oh, no, we all of us Christians just really love this president. And, it's like, wow.
I felt the same.
It was actually startling, but there was a complete unawareness of those kinds of issues.
That's a good question. How do you gently, I found that in Egypt, talked to Egyptians about Sisi, and the most astonishing to me was when somebody, a Christian, and someone I have deep respect for, a Syrian Christian has been in Jordan for years, and said to me with a straight face, "Oh, Assad is a wonderful person. He's a pediatrician. He loves children." And what do you do with that?
Wow.
You know, just disagreeing doesn't help, you know, but I think those are really good questions. Is what are the ways that you kind of draw people out, recognize they have an experience. If you're an Egyptian who was petrified by the Muslim Brotherhood, there's a reason they like Sisi.
Right.
But how do you, without coming as an outsider with arrogance, how do you gently kind of chip away at that?
Raise those issues so that you can, like you said, at least you can have some dialogue about it.
Yeah, that's true in so many cases. And I think the mistake we sometimes make if we come in as a social justice warrior is we come in and say, well, you're wrong, this, and yet we don't have their experience, and we haven't learned from their experience that has informed, rightly or wrongly, has informed why they think this person is great. Yeah. We haven't done the hard work to understand it.
And something I think that came out clearly from your paper that's a real opportunity for ministry with the diaspora in the area of social justice is just helping people navigate the legal migration process. Which you said, this idea, people think that legal migration is so easy. Why don't people do it the right way? And like they say, doing it the right way, legal migration.
First of all, I don't want to scream. Yeah,
it's not clear at all. And even if it were clear, it's very expensive and very timely. So this idea that is a social justice issue, helping these Christians from cultures be able to, not just to come legally, but maintain their legal status, because it's just not easy to do.
Yeah.
And I've seen even here in Tulsa where there's some people who have been here longer, and that's their ministry in diaspora, is helping people to navigate.
That's neat.
The migration process, legally. Because you have to do it legally, but it's complicated. Yeah, it's why
and expensive.
Legally, it's very quick and easy to do it. To not do it legally. But,
that's right. It's good.
Yeah, that's a tradition of social justice. When people come over they want to work in ministry, but that's a social justice issue. It's not easy to come legally a lot of times.
Yeah.
And that was very clear in your paper, which I appreciated. Yeah, that's something we need to be aware of.
Mm-hmm.
We have a former graduate who is in Indiana, and he is pastoring a church called the Bridge, and they have a lot of Hispanics who attend there. But he actually went and got certified so that he could actually process the paperwork of these immigrants. And his church has become known as this immigrant-friendly church. And he was saying that particularly Hispanics, they come from all around, and they'll come to his church. And sometimes they come just because they need help getting through this process. But because he went through the process of getting certified, it's one of the very few, it's a Methodist church. It's one of the very few Methodist churches in the country that actually has this ability. And they're actually trying to train other churches, other members of churches to get this certification so that they can then help these people that are there who do want to do things right, who do want to do things legally. But like you're saying, it's like a labyrinth, in the American immigration system. So to have someone who can walk you through that and really help you, it's huge.
I have a question from an agency institution perspective. Based on your research and conversations with these 15 people and your experience working within an agency, how would you design a structure if it weren't encumbered by existing structures? Like if you were going to just say, this would be ideal. If I could create structures or processes that could really utilize these global cities as nodes, as you discussed, to really take advantage of both the nodes of the global cities and the connective structure of the diaspora, what would you design? What would be some of those key pieces of structure and program or whatever that you would put in there?
Sounds like I need to go to Center for and spend a day with design thinking.
That would be fun. Well, let's do that.
I'll be very honest. I have one answer for that. That's I don't know. I really have not got a grasp on how you structure things that enhance and don't inhibit this. I think it has to be fairly flat. I mean, I can say some general things. I think it's fairly flat, and again, very relational, whatever that means, what that looks like. There is actually a group with the Next Move that's doing organizational structure. That's kind of their topic. I'm not on that team, but they're looking at that. And I can't imagine, that's even for a small agency like us trying to figure this out, is hard. I can't imagine being an IMB or something and trying to figure out how do you organize to do this. One thing that we've been looking at TMS is the whole area of belonging. What does it mean to be a part of TMS? And I think that the answer is going to be somewhere in that. There has to be different ways that you belong to the community that are not just you're either in or you're out. You're either a missionary or you're not a missionary, or you're a donor. But really being willing to blur the categories, still have some language around it, so it kind of helps you understand how do you work with it, but to live with fuzzy lines, which all that sounds very non-structural. And so I think it's going to be a structure that's going to find some way to navigate that kind of balance of having to have structure, you just die in a pile, but having a fuzzy enough structure that you can respond to things. And I don't know how you do that, to be honest. That's a learning area for me.
I think that for me, when it comes to diasporas, I mean, one of the things we have to do as missionaries and missiologists is to not try to do away with the complexity of these communities, right? Because these people are networked, and they're networked with networks of networks and all of these kinds of things. And not to try to look at them as being all the same. And that's why I think, trying to come up with a real firm definition of what a diaspora is a way to try to essentialize these people and their identities, and not understand that these people actually have quite complex relationships and identities. Not everybody's going to feel the same way about their home country as others do. People are going to be networked in different ways. Some will be more integrated into the American system than others are, and there's a lot of complexity there that I think too often when we strategize in missions, we try to overly simplify things, right? So we talk about people groups as if that means, like something clearly bounded. We talk about the 1040 window. We talk about, these kinds of things that they're helpful in some ways.
Right.
Just like you're talking about the categories of diaspora missiology, that's helpful in some ways. But again, like you said, what you have to realize is that there's a lot of overlapping, and those are not going to be really clear boundaries. We can look at them for heuristic reasons, right? That way. But if you're thinking about really developing mission strategy, well, then you have to understand that those boundaries are not clearly demarcated, and therefore it's much more complex, right?
And I'd say of course, this is my organizational philosophy, which Catherine's heard probably more times than she wishes, and is a decentralized approach to structure and management. You simply have to. You can't control all the moving parts and be effective in this. But I believe that before I even knew diaspora was a thing. I just think that decentralized and distributed management and decision making is just the right way to do things. I'd never make a dictator.
I'd like to pick up on comments that Catherine and Steve have made. I was very glad to see you pulling out Samuel Escobar's comments and article on managerial missiology. That was a landmark article, certainly for missiologists, but most missionary organizations have not paid attention to it. They're just as managerial as they've ever been. And so I've got two comments here. One is, I want you to know that we are honoring American Society of Missiology, honoring Samuel Escobar with the Lifetime Achievement Award.
Oh, that's great. That's good news.
Yeah. And of course, the theme, Catherine, you need to come to the ASM meetings this year. It's all about issues of justice. I think the title is something like the lifestyles of the rich and unfamous or something like that.
Nice,
And
nice.
the keynote speaker is Ron Sider.
Wow.
So it's going to really be worthwhile. So I really appreciated you lifting up Samuel Escobar and his important article. But now here's my question. Why has it been so difficult for mission organizations to move beyond essentially geography and people group orientation? These are the two big categories that almost every mission organization, including TMS, tends to focus on. And diaspora just runs roughshod over those two categories. It's a people group concept or a mission by geography. And so why has it been so difficult, and what are some small things that you could do perhaps to even move your own organization in a new direction?
Good question. Yeah, I wrote an article way back in 2011 that actually Steve Wilson used when he developed the whole idea he has of mobilization hubs, where I argued that people groups were not sufficient for mission strategy, but we need to look at emerging cities as a strategy. And so he kind of used some of those things. So I think continue to have those discussions with people. I haven't avoided using some of the terms. I haven't used 1040 in a teaching forever. And the frustration is, like you said, Steve, these are helpful constructs, but we, as you said, we essentialize them. And we're just good at, I think some of that is Western culture. So some of that's just how do we get outside of ourselves and our culture that we want everything to be the 10 steps. So, you know, I'm sure I could sell a book if I said 10 steps to work with the local diaspora. I could probably be rich and famous. That could go.
Hey, that's going to be the title of my book.
I was looking for a new diaspora window, by the way.
But I think having some discussions, we had a good discussion at our board meeting a couple of times ago that I facilitated on some of these topics, what it looks like to mobilize in the majority world. And but the challenge is that so many mission agencies, and I think this was Escobar's critique, they bought into the kind of the corporate metric concepts of what measurements look like.
Yeah.
That you have to have very firm categories for the metrics to work.
Yeah.
And so you have to define people groups with very precise definitions to be able to say what percentage have been reached. And I get that on the one side, although another part of me just totally wants to revolt against that. But on the other hand, I also realized that if people like me around the world, we'd never know what was going on. And so so I get that, but I think that's we fall into those things. So when someone like Escobar makes a critique, people just don't know what to do with it, because it's a lot simpler to have those long lists of people groups, and we say now we've reached 2.01% have been reached. They're no longer unreached. And yeah, I see Grant smiling now on that one. And yeah, and so I think there's some helpful stuff to it, but I think it's been too almost ossified into our mission structures and strategies. So I think just chipping away at it with just discussions and exposing people to the fuzziness of it. Yeah, but it's hard because it sounds good to say we take 3 groups off the unreached people group list this year.
Yeah. But see, you have a better platform now because of this research to speak into that. Exactly.
Yeah, I hope so. But I probably need to spend the day with Catherine on design thinking, because my problem that I still run into is okay, so what? I know what it means for me personally and what it means for its church and its group, but in terms of at the macro level, so what? Yeah. What does it look like? That's where I feel like that's my next mountain to try to start climbing.
Let me ask one question, Jim. And I don't come from the world of missiology, so this may be old stuff for you guys, but when I teach the course called Organizational Assessment, we use Hofstede and his cultural dimensions. And if you guys are, have worked with those, he uses cultural dimensions, individualism versus community, uncertainty avoidance versus us in the West. We want everything linear, and we don't want to have uncertainty. Long-term goals versus short-term thinking. and it's all part of its worldview, right? It's how, you know, those, Hofstede, of course, he has a whole index, you know, various countries, and he's done studies, and he'll use those cultural dimensions to, you know, come up with a kind of a profile, a typical profile. I'm kind of wondering, just as you work with, you know, people in the diaspora, do those kinds of conversations happen in terms of how people begin to compare how I look at the world compared to how you look at the world, and how the Lord might use either one of us to reach people of a similar worldview or a different worldview? And just how that kind of, you know, worldview, cultural thinking comes into, especially people who come out in a diaspora kind of situation. They're looking around at, you know, say a U.S. kind of worldview, and any limited, you know, interaction they may have with others, you know, with other worldviews. Do those kinds of conversations go on, and have they gone on in relationship to the kind of the people that you're talking to?
That's a good question. I've not encountered those as much, and Steve could probably speak to that more than I am. He's probably more in those kinds of settings when those are being discussed. What I have heard talked about, there certainly is in missiology, the idea of near culture. That's not so much a diaspora thing, but a recognition that if there's a culture that's hard to reach, if we can connect with the culture that's close to them,
Right.
that they'll be better equipped to reach that culture. So there's that kind of language, which would be similar to what you're talking about. But seeing that apply specifically in diaspora settings, I've not heard as much. Now, Grant, your research may have gone into that, because I know one of my interests has always been, or one of my little questions has been, for example, Tanzanians who tend to be believers, or Kenyans who tend to be believers in diaspora, would they be well suited to connect with Somalians in mission in a diaspora setting, where they have that common experience of being East Africans in diaspora, navigating migration systems? That's always a question I've had. I think goes along with what you're saying. Would a Kenyan who's living in Atlanta be better suited to connect with Somalian living in Atlanta than I would? And is there that vision? And that's a question I've had, but I've never really probed it.
If I can just say, among Tanzanians, and again, they're very much a minority as a diaspora population, even among the African diaspora, meta-diaspora in the United States. They're you know, much smaller than even the Kenyan diaspora, which even the Kenyans are much smaller than Nigerians and Ghanaians. But the Tanzanians, it may be part of that kind of minority status, but also their culture, and there's a worldview difference, totally based on hospitality. And you mentioned the importance of hospitality. And that's one thing that they struggle with is, you know,
Sure.
I think many of these diaspora populations, like the Tanzanians, put a real focus on hospitality. And they see, even when they work very well, have good relations with American congregations and American Christians, they're shocked at how hospitable we aren't. And so that's the main thing I run into. But Tanzanians, I found that they were very open to working with any other diaspora group. And often Tanzanian pastors, that was one of the things that surprised me, they were actually invited to pastor other diaspora, including African-American congregations. I've ran into many of them who've just been invited to be pastors of Ghanaian congregations, or, you know, of Kenyan congregations.
Okay, so this
And
is
so, yeah.
I think this number must not be right. Maybe I'll
Okay.
check this out.
But I appreciate the fact that, yeah, this idea of hospitality, I think, is the main thing that kind of found shocking, is that big difference in, you know, how much emphasis they put on hospitality, and they don't see that when it comes to the U.S. But they understand it too. But they say it's a struggle for them.
But I've wondered that. And one thing that's been interesting, Bill, related to that is an Indian who's working with us, who's a diaspora himself, and part of his vision is to try to mobilize Indian churches to reach back to India. And he's finding real resistance to that. And what he's also finding is there's not only they're not interested in reaching back to India, they're not interested in connecting with each other. So if you go to a Tamil-speaking church and you're Canada-speaking, they're like, you're in the wrong church. And so there is, and that's what I've had to do, is kind of check my idealism. Is my assumption all these diaspora people are going to be eager to be out there reaching out. And the fact is a lot of them are just kind of hunkering down and trying to exist in this foreign culture, and having a high level of respect and empathy for that, but saying what are the gentle ways to try to encourage moving out. I think that's a balance. But I think that my assumption that, oh yeah, all these Kenyans are going to be reaching Somalians and stuff, a lot of them are just trying to exist as Kenyans or as Bhutanese or whatever else.
Mm-hmm.
But you also found that there can be difference in 1.5 and in the second generation. They have
Right.
more of the ability to, yeah, it's kind of a first generation thing. Sometimes they, it's harder for them, but their children have the ability to reach
And
out.
my second life, I want to do generational studies. I really, I think generational studies are just going to be really fascinating. I think the Koreans are probably the ones, at least in the church context, we probably have the most, we're getting to the third generation, the fourth generation of Korean diaspora now. A lot of them are believers, and I think it's interesting. I saw some articles related to that. I didn't really dive into that, but there's some really significant findings in generational research I think relate to what Bill was saying. Because they can bridge people.
And as you said, they need help with identity. They get,
but identity's a bugger for them.
They get burned out, and
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's a really critical issue when it comes to diaspora studies as well, either within anthropology or missiology. The question, since a key element of diaspora has to do with connections to the home country, what happens when you start getting into the second and into the third generation?
The language,
and so you end up. I know that in some of the recent diaspora or recent migration studies I've been looking at in anthropology, people that have been really involved in like transnationalism and transnational migration and those kinds of things. That's a big issue that they're dealing with now is how do those generations differ and what happens, if you're talking about diaspora, what happens to that diaspora in the second generation, third generation? And I think it depends on the group, right? Obviously that, whereas like Hispanics, I think, tend to be much more bilingual and bicultural, even in second, third generations, than maybe those from other groups, right? This kind of thing. So it would be an interesting empirical question to look at for diaspora studies. Yeah. And certainly if we're talking about mission strategy and those kinds of things, right? We tend to want to reify or essentialize these groups, and they're really quite complex.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I have a question about your research design.
Okay.
I liked your 23-item interview schedule. I thought those were good questions. But I wondered, is 15 interviews enough to draw much of a conclusion? That, to me, that felt like a really minimal number. And maybe Steve can also weigh in on this. Are there reasons why you didn't interview more? And what kind of confidence did you have just from the data from just 15?
I felt like the questions I wanted to answer, I felt like I could get from 15, especially if I got a wide sample. But there was, I felt like I took a couple risks. One was by not getting really broad, there was a risk, and some things I said, I don't have a big enough sample to really make a conclusion on this. So I felt like there was a little bit of risk, but I also wanted to make sure I could take the time to go deep in each one. And I knew if I tried to do 50 or 60, I would end up having to resolve myself to being more, less relational in the interview, less conversational, and more, okay, there's that tick box, this is how they answered. So I felt like having fewer gave me more flexibility and more ability to kind of let the conversation go and then kind of compare them. It was few enough I could line them up with each other just by having all my notes spread out. If I had 50 or 60, I think I'd have had to do more preliminary categorization. So that was just a decision I made. I think it served me well in some areas, but there's no question that there's got to be more tentativeness in my conclusions because of that. No question.
Yeah, you might want to spell that out. You might want to acknowledge that in your conclusions at the end that it was good, deep material. It was limited in terms of the number, and this would be an area for further research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I acknowledged that. I didn't acknowledge the number. I acknowledged the location needed some further testing. But I did acknowledge the number. It's a good point.
Okay, with that, I think we need to go ahead and move into our next segment, into the evaluation. What I need to do is pull most of you out of the session for about 10 minutes in your screen, it'll be something like you're on hold. So I'm going to start doing that right now. And so you will be on hold for a bit of time. Okay, let me keep going here.
It's kind of sad seeing them drop off.
It really is.
Don't worry, Jim. Well, Jim's already gone. I was going to say you're going to be one of them. So
Yeah, Zoom doesn't give you the ability to do this all at one time. You have to go through each person and put them on hold. Now, let's see, there should be 3 of us in the room now, it looks like. We got Steve, Grant, and myself on the screen.
we've lost him.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to take people off hold. Catherine, oh, there's Jim. Okay. I thought I'd lost Jim. All right. I think I get everyone back. We got everybody back? Yeah, looks like it. Good.
Rebecca, how are you doing? You doing okay?
Hello, yes. I see I just appeared back in the meeting.
Yes.
All right. Well, Jim, we like to make you sweat as long as possible.
We've been talking about guitars and all kinds of things.
Yeah, I was texting with Rebecca. I said either it's a long evaluation form or they've been hiding some serious.
You get guys together, and we just start comparing notes. It's like, yeah. Anyway, congratulations, Dr. Ramsay. We're going to be able to,
Hey.
Thank you very much.
You indeed passed with flying colors. We really just want to commend you on the work you've done, and we think just what you're doing. Like we've already said, it's very timely to the time frame we're living in. Just some of the issues that we're having to deal with in the United States.
Yeah.
And so, just thank you, Jim. Let others kind of say what you would like to say to Jim.
Yeah, I'd just like to say it's been a pleasure working with you, and it's I work with a lot of students working on dissertations, and some of them are extremely difficult, as Daryl is very aware. Working with you was actually quite easy because you're a good writer, and so when I would get drafts of things from you, I could actually read them, which was really helpful. And
Right.
and you took suggestions well, and it was really a pleasure to work with you. So thanks for asking me to do this.
Thank you.
Yeah, again, thank you very much. I just really appreciate the opportunity to read your work, and yeah, really appreciate it. Just like very timely, very crucial, and just, but I appreciate more just the work that you do and the fact that this is going to be a contribution, not just to the field, but also just to the kingdom of God, and that you're continuing to use it in ministry. And just appreciate, sacrifices you made to be able to do both, to work in ministry and to do this research. That's so important, and that will continue to be very important. So,
Thank you.
One of the joys of being an old professor or a former professor, I'm 72 going on about 45, is to watch your students go well beyond you. And Jim, you certainly are in that category. And I enjoyed you as a student. I didn't know you well back then in the 80s. But certainly working with you at the Mission Society was just a great experience. And to see Catherine on here and Grant, it just gives me a great feeling of fulfillment and joy. And so you've made my day, if not my week.
Thank you, Daryl. It means a lot.
I know that one of the things that you were hoping that this dissertation could aid is the effect it would have on organizations and how they related to diaspora. And I have you to know that your dissertation has already then affected that, because in that 10-minute or 15-minute break, I'm like, John, get in here. I have some ideas. We're talking about, it sparked some stuff. And so we were talking, and I'm like, why haven't we not thought about some of these particular elements. So I really do want to take you up on that idea to come down to Centerform someday for a day of brainstorming. But it has already, I'm like, I'm drawing this dot and this dot and this dot and this dot. And why we have not been thinking about this particular thing, don't know why. It's not like we haven't been in conversation with you, but I think in reading your dissertation and having some of these conversations, it's kind of a no-brainer for John and I to be thinking about that. So I just want to both congratulate you on this big journey and also to just affirm your work and saying that it has great importance and possibility, even as close as during your dissertation defense, it's affecting another organization. So thank you.
Right. Thanks, Catherine. I will definitely take you up on that.
And I would just say, I want to also thank Grant. Thanks for your willingness to be the reader on this dissertation. I knew you'd be a great person for that, having worked with you and knowing your own interests and diasporas and that. So I thank you for your willingness to be a participant in helping Jim along with this.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for giving me an easy job, like you said, Jim. Writes really well, so it wasn't difficult. It was enjoyable. So yeah, thank you.
All right. Anybody else? Rebecca, Sean, you had to live with this guy for some time.
Rebecca went to the other side of the world to get away from me.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, you're on the other side of the world right now. Yeah, it's getting late, so it's time for you to go to bed.
Yeah, I'm a bit spacey, but I'm so excited that this is finished, and thank you for trying to sort of wait for me to get out of my graduate school first, but I'm glad you were actually able to succeed in finishing it. Honestly, it's a really impressive achievement on top of everything, and I think it's going to open up so many exciting new directions, so I'm excited to see kind of what happens. But I really enjoyed all the conversations about this over the years, even though I neglected to see the email with the dissertation draft. So I will look
you had enough time to read it anyway.
All right.
But congratulations, and
Thank you.
thanks to all of you as well for your support of the project.
All right. You're muted, Sean.
She can't unmute. She doesn't have a microphone hooked up on her computer there. She's just going to listen in. So
Okay. All right. We'll have to.
I can tell you what she wants to say. But
We'll lip it. All right. Well, thanks. All right. Okay, I think we're going to close it off there. I will send you, both the committee people, the form. You guys can give your agreement by email. Jim, you can just work with Judy in the registrar's office, just to kind of, the final pieces, getting the dissertation published, all that kind of jazz.
Great.
I think we have permission from you to go ahead and publish the dissertation, right, in the library?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We'll just make sure that that's on the form. Anything else?
Yeah, I would just say the one revision you might want to look at is the one that Daryl suggested, which is just look at it in the conclusion when you're getting to, or when you talk about the limitations of the study, to kind of go in a little bit and talk about the fact that you let the reader know that you only had 15 interviews, but to talk about it the way you did with us, because I think that it seems like a very small number, but as we talked about it, it also seemed like you were very intentional about, even though it was a small number, getting a wide kind of number of different peoples to participate in that. So you're hearing different voices from different communities, which is really the crux of really what you were trying to find out in your study. So I think if you just clarify that a little bit.
Yeah, I can do that. I can put something in that
Doesn't have to be much or long, but
yeah, I know exactly where it would fit.
Yeah.
And I
Maybe
can
just-
do that. And so that's Judy.
I might mention also in that regard, one of the things that we do, BGU dissertation has a transformational strategy. I think we all agreed, and I think you brought this out, is that the actual ethnographic interview process that you were working with is the transformational strategy, right? Would that?
Yeah, it was kind of hard to delineate that for that reason.
Yeah, but I think that's the way you went about doing the interviews, spending enough time, taking a listening, learning posture. that is the very kind of strategy that you're asking people in mission agencies to be doing, along with the programming, etc. But to be able to make sure that kind of a posture is, what is happening. I think that was the takeaway, at least for me, in terms of the transformation of your project. And I just make sure that that's made clear. You can just look at, in the research methodology chapter, which is chapter 5, I guess. We've got 2 different formats going on. But anyway, I guess it'd be chapter 5. You might just mention that, if you don't see it there, that the very transformational strategy for this project was the ethnographic methodology you used to do your interviewing, spending time with people, that is the important takeaway that you're hoping that this dissertation was producing.
Okay.
Okay. All right, all. Again, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Bill.
Being a part of this journey. And it's just really good to get to know all of you a little bit. And I'm sure hopefully we'll be crossing paths, at least on maybe the virtual airways at different times. So, all right.
Good to see you all in one room.
Good to see you all. Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Daryl, good to see you again.